the spring of 2003, every grain farmer in Lac-Saint-Jean County, Quebec, planted the same way. They tilled in May, planted into bare black soil in June, watched the corn come up in rows as straight and exposed as anything, and they harvested in October and called it a year. This was not a decision. It was not a system anyone had sat down and designed. It was the way the land worked and the way the people who worked it had always understood it. Going back 3 generations to the families who had broken this ground with draft horses and sheer persistence, the soil grew the crop fed the family, and the cycle repeated. Nobody asked whether there was a better way, because the current way had never obviously failed. And in Lac-Saint-Jean in 2003, not obviously failing was the standard most farmers measured themselves against. Let me tell you what not obviously failing looked like in those years, because you need to understand the world Odette Vachon was walking into before you can understand what she did to it. A typical grain operation in Lac-Saint-Jean County ran somewhere between 400 and 900 acres of cropped land and a corn-soybean rotation, sometimes with a third year of cereal rye or winter wheat thrown in to break disease cycles. The fields were tilled every spring without exception, a chisel plow in the fall to break up the residue, a disc in early May to work the soil surface smooth, and then a field cultivator pass right before planting to finish the seed bed. 3 passes over every acre, every year, without anyone questioning whether all 3 were necessary or what they were doing to the soil below the plow layer. The yield numbers were acceptable, not remarkable. Acceptable. Corn came in around 160 to 175 bushels per acre in a good year, soybeans around 45 to 50. The Extension Office published county averages every fall, and most farmers in Lac-Saint-Jean were within 10% of those averages in either direction and considered that normal. The Vachon operation sat on 680 acres in the eastern part of the county, about 12 kilometers from the town of Dolbeau-Mistassini. Odette's father, Gerard Vachon, had farmed it since 1978. The year he finished agricultural college in Saint-Anne-de-la-Pocatière and came home to take over from his own father, who had run the same land since 1955. Gerard was a careful man, methodical in a way that showed in the straight tile lines he had installed himself over 20 years and in the green logbooks he kept on a shelf above his desk in the back room of the house, 1 per year, every entry in the same blue pen, every field identified by its number and its history. He cropped 620 acres in corn and soybeans on a 2-year rotation and left 60 acres in hay to feed the small beef herd his wife Paulette still maintained out of habit and affection. His corn yields averaged 168 bushels per acre, which was consistent with county numbers and which Gerard considered acceptable. He had never seen a reason to expect more from the ground, and nobody in Lac-Saint-Jean had ever suggested he should. Let me tell you about Odette Vachon, because she is the reason this story exists, and she is different from almost every character this channel has ever told you about. Odette was 47 years old in the spring of 2003. She had spent 14 years working as a soil scientist for the federal government, first in Ottawa and then out of a regional office in Chicoutimi, writing reports on soil carbon dynamics and erosion risk in the Saint-Stent. Lawrence lowlands that her supervisors read carefully and her farming neighbors had never heard of. She had come home the previous fall when Gerard's back gave out badly enough that the harvest had to be hired out, and it became clear he would not be returning to the cab of a tractor on any kind of regular basis. She had not planned to come back. She had a mortgage in Chicoutimi and a file cabinet full of unfinished research and a daughter in grade 9 who had to finish the school year by correspondence. She came back anyway because Gerard was her father and the farm was the farm and some obligations do not negotiate. She was not loud about what she knew. She was not the kind of person who walked into a conversation and led with her credentials. She was quiet in the way that people are quiet when they have spent 15 years reading other people's data and have learned to wait for the evidence to speak before saying anything themselves. She had been walking the Vachon fields since she was a child, and she had been looking at them differently since graduate school, And in the fall of 2002, the first autumn she had spent on the farm in over a decade, she had walked every field with a soil probe and a notebook and written down what she found. What she found was not a catastrophe. It was something quieter and more persistent than a catastrophe, which is in some ways worse. The topsoil across the eastern fields, the ones her grandfather had broken first, was running between 14 and 17 centimeters deep. The county extension maps from 1965 had estimated those same fields at 22 to 26 centimeters. The soil organic matter in the continuous corn ground was testing at 1.9%. Literature values for undisturbed Quebec agricultural soil in this region ran between 3.5 and 5%. The earthworm counts she had done in October, 10 cores per field, averaged 4.2 worms per core in the tilled ground. Research from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada showed healthy tilled soils in this region, averaging 11 to 14. The soil was not gone, it was not ruined, it was producing, but it was producing on borrowed capital, and the interest payments had been coming out of the principal for decades, without anyone noticing because the yields had stayed acceptable. She had a solution. She had been reading about it and thinking about it for years, and she had 23 pages of notes in a gray binder she had carried back from Chicoutimi. It was called no-till farming, combined with cover cropping. The idea was not new. It had been practiced seriously in the American Midwest and in Ontario since the 1980s, and a growing number of Quebec agronomists were beginning to take it seriously. The basic principle was straightforward. You stopped tilling the soil. You planted directly into the residue of the previous crop using a specialized no-till planter that could cut through the mat of old stems and set seed at the right depth without disturbing the soil around it. And between your cash crops, you seeded a cover crop mix, radishes, oats, crimson clover, cereal rye, species chosen to keep living roots in the ground through the shoulder seasons, to feed the soil biology, to hold the surface against rain and wind, and to build back the organic matter and soil structure that 50 years of tillage had been quietly dismantling. Let me tell you about the science, because the science is the reason this story ends the way it does. Soil is not dirt. That is the first thing a soil scientist will tell you, and it is not a semantic point. A tablespoon of healthy agricultural soil contains more living organisms than there are people on Earth. Bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, arthropods, earthworms. A community of life so dense and so interconnected that its structure determines whether a field retains water in a drought, whether it releases nutrients when a crop needs them, whether it holds together when a hard rain hits the surface at 60 kilometers an hour. Tillage breaks that community apart. Every pass of a disc or a chisel plow is an earthquake to the organisms living in the top 20 centimeters of soil. It disrupts the fungal networks that move phosphorus and water to plant roots. It breaks apart the aggregate structures that give soil its capacity to hold air and water simultaneously. It buries the surface residue that feeds the decomposer community and exposes the bare soil to sun and rain and wind. The yields stay up for a while because you are releasing stored organic matter as a nutrient flush every time you till, like burning the furniture to heat the house. But the organic matter declines slowly and steadily, and with it the water-holding capacity and the drought resilience and the long-run productivity of the ground. Cover crops interrupt this cycle. Living roots feed soil biology continuously, not just during the cash crop season. Radishes drill deep tap roots that fracture compaction layers and die over winter, leaving channels that subsequent crop roots can follow. Cereal rye produces a massive surface mulch that suppresses weeds, buffers soil temperature, and slows the evaporation of soil moisture. Legumes like clover fix atmospheric nitrogen that the next cash crop can use. A well-designed multi-species cover crop mix can increase soil organic matter by 0.2 to 0.4 percentage points per year under good management. On Vachon ground, running at 1.9% organic matter in the worst fields, that meant the difference between a soil that cracked open in a dry July and a soil that kept the corn roots supplied through a 2-week stretch without rain. Odette had done the math. If she could recover even 0.5 percentage points of organic matter across the eastern fields over 3 years, the improvement in water holding capacity alone would reduce the probability of a serious yield loss in the drought year by an estimated 30%. The no-till planter required to make the transition was a significant capital cost. A good used machine would run $45,000 to $60,000. The cover crop seed would add $35 to $55 per acre in the first 2 years. But the elimination of 3 tillage passes per year would save roughly $60 per acre in fuel, labor, and equipment wear. On 400 acres, that was $24,000 per year in immediate savings, almost regardless of what happened to the soil biology. She brought this to the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening in March of 2003. Odette Vachon listened to his daughter for 30 minutes without interrupting. He looked at the gray binder. He looked at the cost estimates she had written on graph paper. Income on one side and expense on the other, the numbers adding up in a direction he had not expected. He set his coffee cup down partway through and did not pick it up again. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet for a long moment. Odette Vachon, who had been listening from the doorway of the living room where she had been pretending to watch television, came in and sat down at the table without being asked, and said without ceremony that the numbers looked right to her. Gerard looked at his wife. He looked at his daughter. He looked back at the graph paper. "I need to think about it," he said. He thought about it for 10 days. What he said at the end of those 10 days was this: the East Quarter, 160 acres, 1 season. We'll see what comes of it. He paused. "Don't touch the home quarter until we know something." Odette said that was fine. Now let me tell you about the man who made sure that as many people as possible knew about Odette Vachon's daughter and her refusal to till, because no story like this one is complete without someone who looks at an unfamiliar idea and decides that mockery is the appropriate response. His name was Conrad Beaulieu. He was 61 years old in 2003, and he had been the primary agronomist and de facto social anchor of the Lac-Saint-Jean County Grain Growers Association for 23 years. Having come up through the Quebec Ministry of Agriculture Extension Service in the 1970s and pivoted into private consulting when the ministry's budget cuts had made extension work impossible to do properly, Conrad Beaulieu was not a stupid man. He was not a malicious man. He was a man who had spent 20 years advising farmers in this county and who had seen enough yield comparisons and soil test results and equipment demonstrations to have formed very firm opinions about what worked and what didn't. And those opinions had been validated often enough over 2 decades that he had stopped treating them as opinions and had started treating them as facts. He held court at the grain growers' monthly meeting the way a parish priest holds court at a Saturday night social, with warmth and authority and the absolute certainty that comes from being the most knowledgeable person in the room for longer than most people can remember. His recommendations carried weight. When Conrad Beaulieu said a variety was worth trialing, farmers trialed it. When he said a practice was risky, farmers stepped back from it. Odette made the mistake, if it was a mistake, and in the long run it probably wasn't, of attending the April meeting of the grain growers and mentioning in response to a direct question about what she was planting that spring, that she was going no-till on the East Quarter and putting in a cover crop mix after harvest. The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. Conrad Beaulieu smiled the smile of a man who has heard something that confirms a pattern he has observed many times before. "Odette," he said. And he said her name in the tone that people use when they want to sound kind while being dismissive. "I've been advising grain farmers in this county for 20 years. I've seen no-till trials come and go. The problem isn't the theory. The problem is Quebec springs. You got 4 weeks between snowmelt and planting and the ground is cold and wet, and no-till residue holds that coldness in. Your corn emergence is going to be slow. Your stands are going to be uneven. And you're going to spend July watching your neighbor's corn outgrow yours by 10 days. He paused. "The organic matter story is real, but you don't need to stop tilling to build organic matter. You can till and add manure." He looked at the man sitting 2 seats over, a farmer named Wilfred Goslin who ran 500 acres just north of town, and Wilfred Goslin made the small nod of a man who is not entirely sure he agrees, but is not going to say so in this room. Odette looked at Conrad Beaulieu for a moment without changing her expression. "The cold soil concern is well documented," she said. "It's addressed by adjusting planting depth and using row cleaners on the planter to move the residue away from the seed furrow. The emergence data from Ontario no-till trials on comparable soils shows a 2 to 4 day lag in cool springs that closes by B3 with no yield impact. The organic matter literature is pretty clear that tillage-based systems can't build organic matter faster than they deplete it on a net basis, regardless of manure additions, because the tillage itself is the depletion mechanism." She paused. "I've got the papers in my truck if anyone wants to look at them." Conrad Beaulieu smiled. "I appreciate the research," he said, "but I've been watching this specific soil in this specific county for 20 years. I think I know a few things. The papers don't." Odette bought her cover crop seed the following week and drove home. Let me pause here because I think it's worth sitting with what happened in that meeting room for a moment before we go further. Conrad Beaulieu had 20 years of direct experience in Lac-Saint-Jean County. He was not wrong that he knew these soils. He was not wrong that he had seen ideas arrive from other provinces and fail to translate to Quebec conditions. What he was wrong about was the nature of his own knowledge. 20 years of advising conventional tillage systems is 20 years of watching one system operate under one set of assumptions. It is not 20 years of comparative data. He had never seen a well-managed no-till cover crop system on Lac-Saint-Jean ground because nobody in the county had run one long enough to produce meaningful numbers. His certainty was not built on evidence. It was built on the absence of a counterexample, and the absence of a counterexample is not the same thing as proof. Odette knew the difference. Conrad Beaulieu, at that moment, did not. Let me tell you about the spring and summer of 2003, because that first season on the East Quarter is where the story begins to turn. Odette sourced a used no-till planter from a farm in Bruce County, Ontario, a 12-row John Deere 7000 series with row cleaners and no-till coulters that the previous owner had run for 4 seasons on heavy clay soils, heavier than anything in Lac-Saint-Jean. She spent 3 weeks in April going over the planter in the shed, replacing the coulter bearings, adjusting the down pressure springs, setting the row cleaners to move residue aggressively from the seed furrow without disturbing the soil beneath. She kept a log. Every adjustment got a date and a note and a reason. She planted the East Quarter on May 22nd, 3 days after her neighbors had finished planting their tilled ground. The delay was deliberate. She waited for the soil at seed depth to reach 10 degrees Celsius, which the no-till residue had been holding back by 2 to 3 degrees. When she planted into ground that had not been touched by a tillage implement since the previous October's combine, and the surface was still covered with the gray mat of last year's corn stalks laying flat under their own weight. The planter cut through it cleanly. The seedbed in the furrow was undisturbed and moist in a way that her father's tilled fields, which had crusted in the 2 weeks since tillage, were not. She kept records. Every field got a date, a seeding depth measurement, and an emergence count at 7 days and 14 days. She walked the field with a stand count at V2 and again at V6. She photographed everything. The emergence on the East Quarter was 4 days slower than her neighbors' tilled corn, which came up on May 28th. Conrad Beaulieu drove past on the county road on the 1st of June and noted the uneven green of the emerging stand and said to Wilfred Goslin, whom he happened to be visiting that afternoon, that it was going about as he'd expected. By the 3rd week of June, the gap had closed. By early July, the East Quarter corn was visually indistinguishable from the tilled fields on the west side of the farm. The stand count was 31,200 plants per acre against a target of 32,000. Acceptable by the standards of the county. Acceptable by the standards of the county. Acceptable. But the soil was doing something that the yield monitor could not capture yet. In mid-July, Odette pushed a soil probe into the east quarter in 5 locations and recorded the depth to resistance. The average was 43 centimeters. She pushed the same probe into the home quarter, which had been tilled as usual that spring, in 5 matching locations. The average was 28 centimeters, 1 season, 1 spring without tillage. The compaction layer in the east quarter was already beginning to break apart, not from any mechanical intervention but from the corn root channels drying and collapsing and leaving macropores behind, exactly as the literature had documented. She wrote all of this down. She did not say anything to her father yet. In late August, she seeded the cover crop mix into the standing corn on the east quarter using a high-clearance applicator she borrowed from a soil health cooperative in the Beauce region. The mix was cereal rye, radish, and crimson clover at rates she had calculated from University of Guelph recommendations, adjusted for Lac-Saint-Jean's shorter growing season. The rye germinated within 10 days under the corn canopy. By the time she harvested the corn in late September, there was a 6-centimeter stand of mixed cover crops already established in the field, green and growing in the wheel tracks between the corn rows. Her father walked the field with her the week after harvest. He did not say anything for a long time. He looked at the green cover crop standing in the corn stubble, and he looked at the home quarter across the road, which was bare black soil already crusting in the October wind. He pushed his boot into the surface of the east quarter and felt the residue mat give slightly but hold. He looked at the cover crop again. "It doesn't look like farming," he said. "No," Odette said, "it doesn't." "What does it look like in spring?" "Green," she said, "until the frost finishes it. Then it lies down and you plant through it." He was quiet for a moment. "And the yield?" The combine monitor had recorded 171 bushels per acre on the east quarter. The home quarter, tilled as usual, had come in at 164, a difference of 7 bushels per acre in the first year, on ground that Odette had identified as the less productive half of the farm. She had spent $4,200 on the cover crop seed. At 2003 corn prices of approximately $3.40 per bushel, the additional yield represented $23,800 in additional revenue above what the same acreage would have produced under the conventional system, against a seed cost she would not have to repeat at full price as the system matured. She had also saved $22,000 in tillage costs across the 160 acres. First-year net advantage over the conventional approach, approximately $41,600. She put this on graph paper and brought it to the kitchen table in November. Odette Vachon looked at the numbers for a long time. He picked up the graph paper and held it closer to the lap above the table. Paulette sat down without being asked, the way she had at the first presentation, except this time she sat down before Odette had finished her first sentence. Gerard set the paper down. He was quiet for what felt like a long time. Then he said, quietly and without ceremony, "You were right." He did not apologize for the 10-day pause. He did not revisit the skepticism. He just said she was right in the same measured tone he used for everything, and then he picked up his coffee and finished it. But Odette said that after supper, instead of going to the back room to watch the news the way he usually did, he came back to the table and asked her to walk him through the planter settings again from the beginning. They sat there until almost 11 o'clock. When she finally went upstairs, she heard him in the back room, taking down the green logbook from the shelf. He gave her the home quarter in the spring of 2004. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the east quarter was the proof of concept, but the home quarter is where the story became something larger. The home quarter was 240 acres, which Odette transitioned to no-till in the spring of 2004 and seeded to cover crops in the fall of the same year. She increased the diversity of the cover crop mix in year 2, adding tillage radish for compaction breaking and hairy vetch for nitrogen fixation alongside the rye and clover. By midsummer of 2004, soil probe measurements in the paddocks that had gone through one full no-till season were averaging 52 centimeters depth to resistance. The earthworm counts she ran in July were averaging 9.1 worms per core, more than double the 4.2 she had recorded in the tilled ground 2 years earlier. In 2004, the combined operation, all 400 acres of crop ground, yielded 179 bushels per acre on corn and 51 on soybeans. The corn improvement was 11 bushels above the 2002 baseline. The soybean improvement was 6 bushels. Combined additional revenue over baseline, accounting for the tillage savings and cover crop costs, $67,000. Gerard looked at those numbers in November and said, "You decide the rotation next year." He meant it as a transfer of authority, and Odette understood it that way. The people who drove the county road understood it differently. They understood it as a curiosity. Farmers who had been driving past the Vachon fields for 20 years had never seen 400 acres of cover crops standing green in October while every other field in the county lay bare and black. It looked wrong. It looked like something a person would do if they did not understand how Quebec grain farming worked. And this assessment circulated through the grain growers' meetings with the persistence of a conviction that nobody wanted to test directly against the Vachon numbers, which nobody at those meetings had quite gotten around to asking for. Conrad Beaulieu had a theory about why the Vachon yields were slightly misleading, something about how the East Quarter had always been the better drained ground, or how the yield monitor calibration might account for the difference, or how 1 or 2 seasons was not enough data to draw conclusions from. This theory was not wrong to raise. 1 or 2 seasons is genuinely not enough data to draw conclusions from in agronomy, but the theory had a way of being raised consistently enough to function as a reason not to look more closely at the numbers, which is a different thing from a legitimate scientific caution. The drought came in 2007. Let me tell you about the summer of 2007, because that summer is the reason this story is still being told, and because it is the moment when the quiet argument that had been running through Lac-Saint-Jean County for 4 years finally got an answer that nobody could dispute. The drought of 2007 was the worst in the county since 1984. Rainfall from June through August ran 38% below the 30-year average. The corn crop across the region was in serious trouble by the second week of July. Fields that had been tilled conventionally had soil that had already shed its surface residue through oxidation and wind and was presenting bare, crusted surfaces to a sun that hadn't been interrupted by meaningful cloud cover since the 3rd week of June. Wilt symptoms appeared in corn as early as July 14th on the sandier ground. Wilfred Gosselin, running 500 acres just north of town, had fields that were showing visible leaf rolling by July 20th. He applied for crop insurance inspection in early August. His final corn yield was 98 bushels per acre. His soybeans failed almost entirely in the northwest quarter and came in at 19 bushels per acre on the better ground. The losses across the county from drought stress, crop insurance shortfalls, and emergency irrigation costs, for those who had irrigation available, ran into the millions of dollars. The Vachon fields looked different. They did not look lush. This was not a miracle of rainfall. The drought was real and Odette's fields felt it, but the East Quarter, now in its 5th year of no-till management, had soil organic matter that had climbed from 1.9% in 2002 to 3.1% by the fall of 2006, an improvement of 1.2 percentage points in 4 years that would have taken 40 years to achieve under conventional management. Soil at 3.1% organic matter holds approximately 7% more water per unit volume than soil at 1.9%. On 160 acres in a drought year, that water retention differential measured in the tens of thousands of liters per hectare. The cover crop residue lying on the surface, the gray-brown mat of winter-killed rye and radish that the no-till planter had seeded through in spring, was acting as a mulch, slowing evaporation from the soil surface by an amount that the university research put at 30 to 40% in comparison to bare-tilled ground. Odette did not irrigate in 2007. She did reduce her planting population slightly in early July by making the decision not to replant a 12-acre section of the northwest corner that had emerged poorly after a late frost. She let the cover crops she had seeded with the corn in May continue to germinate in that section and used it as a soil recovery block, rather than try to salvage a partial yield. She had enough flexibility in her rotation to absorb that decision without financial catastrophe. A tilled system would not have had that flexibility. In October, when the County Extension Office published its summary, the Vachon corn came in at 162 bushels per acre on the managed ground. Wilfred Gosselin's comparable fields had come in at 98. The county average was 112. Odette's per-acre productivity in the worst drought year in 23 years was 45% above the county average. She had not bought $1 of emergency inputs. She had not filed a crop insurance claim. The cover crop seed she had purchased every fall since 2003 had cost her an average of $42 per acre per year, a total investment of approximately $160,000 over 5 seasons. The drought year alone, by holding her yield at 162 bushels against a county average of 112 on comparable acres, had returned more than the entire 5-year cover crop investment in a single harvest. She did not go to the grain growers' meeting and announce this. She went to the Regional Office of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Chicoutimi and sat down with a soil scientist she had worked with years earlier, a woman named Dr. Chicoutimi, Lise Fortier, who had been following the Vachon operation with quiet interest since 2004, and she went through her data with Dr. Fortier, field by field, year by year, and she answered questions for 3 hours. And when she left a copy of her field records and a summary of the soil test data she had been collecting since 2002. Dr. Fortier published a case study of the Vachon operation in the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada regional newsletter in February of 2008. It ran 4 pages. It included the yield comparisons, the soil organic matter trend data, the drought year revenue analysis, and a description of the cover crop mix and no-till planter setup with a diagram that looked a great deal like the diagram Odette had sketched in the grade binder she had carried home from Chicoutimi 5 years earlier. Let me tell you about the morning in March of 2008 when Conrad Beaulieu drove out to the Vachon farm, because that morning is where the account gets settled. He came on a Thursday, arriving around 10 in the morning. Odette was in the shed recalibrating the no-till planter's seed meters ahead of spring planting. She heard the truck in the yard and came out to find Conrad Beaulieu standing by his door looking at the east quarter, which was still dormant under a late winter cover of flattened rye mulch, pale gold against the gray sky. The surface continuous and unbroken in a way that the bare, black-tilled fields, visible 2 farms over, were not. He was not the same man who had smiled at the meeting in April of 2003. He still had the same coat and the same careful way of standing with his hands in his pockets when he was thinking something through. But something in his posture had changed. He looked, Odette thought, like a man who had been arguing with something in private for a long time and had recently stopped arguing. "I read Fortier's piece," he said. Odette waited. "The drought year numbers," he said. "Those are your combine monitor records." "Combined with the crop insurance adjuster's field assessments," she said. Dr. Fortier pulled the county data herself for the comparison. Conrad Beaulieu nodded slowly. He looked at the east quarter again. He looked at the rye mulch lying flat on the surface. "I told you the residue would hold the soil temperature back in spring," he said. "I told you your stands would lag and your early growth would suffer." He said it without the confident smile of 2003. He said it the way a person reads back a prediction they made in writing and finds it was partly right and importantly wrong. "You did," Odette said. "The emergence did lag. 4 days in the first year," she said. 2 days by year 3. Statistically 0 by year 5. He was quiet for a moment. The wind came off the east quarter and moved the surface of the rye mulch in a slow wave. "I've got 7 farmers who've called me since Fortier's piece came out," he said. "They want to know how to start. I don't know how to answer them." He paused. "I know tillage. I don't know this." Odette looked at him for a moment. "The lesson isn't that my fields are exceptional," she said. "The lesson is that any farm that moves soil every spring without exception is making a withdrawal it can't see on the account statement. The drought didn't damage those fields. The drought just showed what the decades of tillage had already taken away: the organic matter, the structure, the biology. It was already gone. The dry summer just removed the mask. She paused. The cover crops give back what the tillage took. That's the whole thing. That's all it is. Conrad Beaulieu looked at her. He nodded once, the slow nod of a man accepting a correction he cannot answer with a counter-argument. "Could you talk to those 7 farmers?" he said. "Yes," she said, "I can do that." Let me tell you about the years that followed that March morning, because the conversation in the Vachon farmyard was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a different one. By the spring of 2009, Odette was managing all 620 acres of Vachon cropland under no-till with a full cover crop rotation, with per-acre yields running 21% above the 2002 baseline on corn and 17% above on soybeans, and with soil organic matter in the oldest no-till ground now testing at 3.8%. The earthworm counts in the east quarter were averaging 13 per core. The compaction layer that had been at 28 centimeters in the tilled home quarter in 2003 was no longer detectable at any of her standard probe locations. The 7 farmers who had called Conrad Beaulieu after Dr. Fortier's newsletter piece came out to the Vachon farm in April of 2009. Odette walked them through the planter setup, explained the cover crop selection and seeding timing, showed them the soil probe data and the yield monitor records, and answered their questions for most of a spring afternoon. 6 of them transitioned at least a portion of their acres to no-till that same spring. By the fall of 2009, all 6 reported better than expected outcomes on their transitioned acres. Word spread the way word always spreads in a farming community, through the elevator lineups, through the equipment dealer's waiting room, through the quiet conversations at the Farm Bureau office where Odette had started showing up and where she had begun, carefully and with data, to talk about what she was seeing. By 2011, 31 farms in Lac-Saint-Jean County were running some form of no-till or reduced tillage with cover crops. By 2013, that number was 58. Dr. Fortier presented a regional summary at the Quebec Agri-Forum in Quebec City in 2012, and the session drew a standing room crowd. She named the Vachon operation as the foundational case. Odette was in the back row. She was 56 years old. She was wearing a Carhartt vest and had a soil sample bag sticking out of her left jacket pocket because she had pulled cores on the way out of the driveway that morning. When Dr. Fortier said her name, the people around her turned to look, and someone near the front started clapping, and the room followed. Gerard Vachon was there. He had driven down from Dolbeau-Mistassini with Paulette the night before and had spent the evening complaining about the hotel mattress and asking the waiter at the restaurant whether the pea soup was made fresh. He was sitting 4 seats to Odette's right. When the room started clapping, he stood up. He did not look at his daughter. He looked at the front of the room, at the soil organic matter trend line on Dr. Fortier's slide, and he stood up straight, the way a man stands when he is proud of something he is not entirely sure how to say. Let me tell you about one last thing, because this story has one more turn in it, and it happens at the Vachon kitchen table in the spring of 2015. Odette was 59. She had been running the Vachon operation for 12 years by then. Gerard had stepped back almost entirely to a Sunday morning walk of the fields and a weekly review of the logbooks, which gave him what he needed and cost him nothing he could no longer afford to spend. The farm was producing at levels that would have seemed implausible to anyone who had known it in 2002. At supper one evening in April, Odette's son-in-law, a quiet and careful man named Etienne Roux, who had married her daughter Camille 3 years earlier and who had been working the Vachon acres through 2 full seasons by then, slid a stack of printed articles across the table. He had been reading about agroforestry, specifically about integrating tree rows into the cropped fields, windbreaks of hybrid poplar and black walnut interspersed with shrub rows of elderberry and hawthorn, both for the windbreak benefit and for the habitat and the long-term carbon it would place in the woody biomass of the farm over decades. He had the numbers from a Laval University trial and a summary from the Woodlot Improvement Program. Odette looked at the articles. She looked at Etienne. She thought about a gray binder and a kitchen table in 2003 and a father who had needed 10 days. She thought about the East Quarter in July of 2007, with the soil holding moisture 2 weeks into a drought, while the fields across the road burned brown. She looked at the articles for a long time. Then she looked up at her son-in-law. "Yes," she said, "let's try it." She did not need 10 days. Odette Vachon was at the table. He heard the exchange. He picked up one of Etienne's articles and read the first paragraph. He set it down. He said nothing. But later that evening, Odette saw him in the back room, taking down the green logbook from the shelf and carrying it to the kitchen table and opening it to a fresh page, the pen uncapped, the numbers ready to be written. Some things you learn from the evidence the first time, and some things you learn by watching someone else take the evidence seriously and being honest enough with yourself to recognize what you're seeing. Odette Vachon had learned it the hard way over 2 droughts and 4 soil test cycles and 23 years of watching his daughter's unplowed fields outperform everything he had built over a careful and methodical career. He had learned it well enough that when his son-in-law pushed a stack of articles across the same table where Odette had first laid out her gray binder in 2003, he did not reach for the reasons to wait. He reached for the logbook. The East Quarter in Lac-Saint-Jean County still runs on no-till. The home quarter still runs on no-till. The soil organic matter in the oldest fields is now above 4.5%. which Dr. Fortier's office calls the highest recorded for continuously cropped agricultural land in the region. Odette Vachon still walks the fields every October with a soil probe and a notebook. Not the gray binder, which filled up in 2009, but a series of red notebooks she has kept since then, one per year, on the same shelf in the back room where her father used to keep the green logbooks. The 2 sets of notebooks sit side by side, his handwriting and hers. The same shelf. Different conclusions about what the land could do if you stopped insisting on waking it up every spring just because that was how it had always been done. Conrad Beaulieu retired in 2014 at his retirement event at the Dolbeau-Mistassini Agricultural Center. He gave a short address in which he said that the thing he was proudest of in 23 years of advising farmers was that he had been wrong about something important early enough that the people he worked with could still benefit from the correction. He did not say Odette Vachon's name. He did not need to. Every farmer in that room knew whose fields he was talking about. She planted cover crops in a bare field county. She stopped tilling in a county that had tilled every spring since the homesteaders arrived. They said the residue would hold the cold in and the stands would suffer. The drought came. The tilled fields went brown and the yield monitors came in at 98 bushels where they should have been 160. The covered fields held their moisture. The notebooks kept filling. And the lesson that a soil scientist with a gray binder and 15 years of federal data wrote out at a kitchen table in Dolbeau-Mistassini in March of 2003 is still being taught, 1 unplowed acre at a time, on ground that finally got the rest it had been waiting for. I keep thinking about that October walk. Odette and Gerard moving through the East Quarter after harvest, the cover crop already coming up green between the corn stubble, and Gerard pushing the toe of his boot into the residue mat and saying quietly that it didn't look like farming. He wasn't wrong. It didn't look like anything he had spent 40 years learning to recognize as farming. That was exactly the point. What strikes me most about this story isn't the yield numbers, though the numbers are real and they matter. It's the sequence of causes that made those numbers possible. Odette didn't get lucky in 2007. She got prepared in 2003. Every cover crop she seeded, every pass she didn't make with the chisel plow, every soil probe reading she recorded in that gray binder was a decision that compounded forward in time. The drought didn't reward her. The drought revealed what she had already built, the same way it revealed what decades of tillage had already taken away from the fields across the road. What you do in the ordinary years determines what you have left in the hard ones. That's not fortune. That's arithmetic. And I think about Conrad Beaulieu standing in that farmyard in March of 2008, looking at the rye mulch on the East Quarter and saying, slowly, that he had told her the residue would hold the cold in. He wasn't trying to wriggle out of anything. He was doing the honest thing, which is harder than it sounds. Reading back a prediction you made publicly and admitting precisely and without drama where it was right and where it fell short. That takes a kind of integrity that doesn't get talked about enough. Not the integrity of never being wrong, because nobody manages that. The integrity of staying accurate about yourself when you find out that you were. Odette had a different kind of integrity, the kind that shows up before there's any reward for it. She walked every field in 2002 with a probe and a notebook and wrote down what she found, not because anyone asked her to, and not because the numbers were going to be encouraging, but because she had decided that the truth of the soil mattered more than the comfort of not knowing it. That's not a dramatic choice. It looks like a lot of early mornings with cold hands and a clipboard, but it's the choice that everything else in this story follows from. What I find hardest to describe is the stubbornness it took to stay the course through 2003 and 2004 and 2005, when the results were promising but not yet definitive, when Conrad Baillou's theory about misleading numbers was still circulating at the grain growers' meetings, when the fields looked wrong to every neighbor who drove past. That kind of persistence isn't stubbornness for its own sake. It's the discipline of staying with evidence when the social pressure is running the other direction. It's believing that the soil probe doesn't care what the meeting room thinks. Gerard standing up at that conference in Quebec City without looking at his daughter, that image stays with me. He was looking at the trend line on the slide. He was proud of the data. And I think that's the right way to be proud of something like this, not of having been right, but of having been honest enough, eventually, to recognize what the evidence was telling you, and to act on it before it was too late to matter. The soil didn't forgive anyone. It just responded to what was done to it the way things do.